Hey folks, today we're going to learn about natural selection. By the time you finish this video, you should know what natural selection is and what are the 4 factors that affect natural selection. And those factors include overproduction, genetic variation, selection, and adaptations. So first off, what is natural selection? Natural selection is the process by which an organism that inherits beneficial traits ends up having better success at surviving just long enough so it can reproduce and pass on those traits. Basically, natural selection states that those organisms that are best fit for their environment are more likely to reproduce and pass on their traits. The 4 parts of natural selection are overproduction, which is where many organisms are produced at a time; genetic variation, which is just the natural differences among members of a species; selection, which is where organisms that live long enough get to reproduce and pass on their traits, and in turn we call those traits that are passed on selected because they go on to the next generation; and adaptations, which are just inherited traits that help an organism to survive. So let's look at an example of overproduction. Fish have the ability to lay thousands of eggs at a time. And this could be beneficial because there's a greater chance that at least one of those eggs will end up surviving. And then it will mature into an adult fish and be able to reproduce and pass on traits. Having more eggs will also increase the amount of genetic variation. So there'll be more fish with different traits, and it's more likely that at least some of them will be able to survive. However, one downside to overproduction is that sometimes you might end up with all of those fish surviving, and then you have way too many in your population of fish, and you don't have enough food for everyone to live. This could affect not only their own species, because there's too many of those fish to survive, but it could affect other aquatic life in the area, because they're taking a lot of the food, and a lot of aquatic life eats the same food. The next 2 examples we're going to look at genetic variation and selection at the same time. So the first one is bacteria. Bacteria grow very rapidly through a process called binary fission. That's basically just cell division, but since they don't have a nucleus, they're prokaryotes, they don't go through mitosis. Since mitosis plays no role in their reproductive cycle, there's a lot more room for error when they copy and then divide up their DNA. This room for error leads to an increase in genetic mutations, which leads to some bacteria having some traits and some having other traits, which is basically what genetic variation is. When we take an antibiotic when we're sick, the antibiotic's job is to kill bacteria. If the bacteria is mutated enough that it can withstand the antibiotic attack, it will reproduce. This leads to those traits that made the bacteria resistant to antibiotics getting selected or passed on to the next generation. Then it's up to the pharmaceutical companies to create new antibiotics each year so that we can kill these new strains of bacteria. Here's a short video clip of an experiment that some scientists ran with bacteria to show how it can mutate through multiple generations.
So what we ended up building was basically a petri dish, except that it's 2 feet by 4 feet. And the way we set it up is that there are 9 bands, and at the base of each of these bands, we put a normal petri dish thick agar with different amounts of antibiotic. On the outside, there's no antibiotic. Just in from that, there's barely more than the E. coli can survive. Inside of that, there's 10 times as much, 100 times, and then finally the middle band has 1,000 times as much antibiotic. And then across the top of it, pour some thin agar that bacteria can move around in. The background is black because there's ink in it, and the bacteria appear as white. First, you see they spread in the area where there's no antibiotic, up until the point they can no longer survive. Then a mutant appears on the right. It's resistant to the antibiotic, it spreads, until it starts to compete with other mutants around it. When these mutants hit the next boundary, they too have to pause and develop new mutations to make it into 10 times as much antibiotic. And then you see the different mutants repeat this at 100. And after about 11 days, they finally make it into 1,000 times as much antibiotic as the wild type can survive. And so we can see by this process of accumulating successive mutations that bacteria, which are normally sensitive to an antibiotic, can evolve resistance to extremely high concentrations in a short period of time.
Our second example is the great Jaguar. Around 11,000 years ago, the Jaguar nearly went extinct because there was an extreme shortage of food. In fact, the only food that they had available were hard-shelled reptiles. So due to genetic variation, some of those jaguars had larger jaws than others, and those larger jaws allowed them to break open the reptiles' shells and then eat the reptiles. Those with smaller jaws ended up dying out because they couldn't get enough food to survive, and they weren't able to pass on their small jaw trait. The larger jaw jaguars were able to pass on their large jaws and keep the species going. Thusly, due to environmental conditions, the large jaw was the selected trait for this species. Finally, let's look at an example of adaptation. You've already seen an example of this with the jaguars, as their large jaw helped them to survive. In that case, the large jaw would be considered an adaptation. Another common adaptation that we see is camouflage. So if you think about a fish that lives in a river or a pond, you might notice that the top side of the fish is a bit darker than the bottom side of the fish. This is a form of camouflage because when you're a predator, like maybe a bird or a duck sitting on top of the water, and you're looking down, the water's usually pretty dark and murky, and that helps the fish to blend in because the bird's seeing the top side of the fish. If you're a larger fish that swims towards the bottom of the pond and you're looking up into the sunlight, and it's very white. So when you look up and see the underside of another fish that's white, you don't really notice it as much. It's important to remember that these fish don't get to choose what they look like, but it just so happens that those fish that have this good camouflage trait are more likely to not get eaten before they have a chance to reproduce and pass on their traits. That's what makes camouflage an adaptation in this case. So to summarize natural selection, let's think about the classic example of a population of tan mice. So these mice, they lived in a light-colored sand-filled beach on a volcanic island. But due to climate change, the sea level rose and the tan mice had to move more inland, where the ground is made of dark-colored lava. So these tan mice, now they're on a dark ground and they're light tan, they stuck out like a sore thumb to the predatory birds in the area. Luckily, mice reproduce fairly quickly. So they underwent a period of overproduction where they produced a whole bunch of mice, and due to the natural effects of genetic variation, some of those mice inherited genes for black fur, which helped them to blend in better. These black-furred mice blended in with their new environment so the birds couldn't see them. Unfortunately, most of their tan-furred friends were easily spotted and then eaten. Since having black fur helped those mice to survive, we considered having black fur as being an advantageous trait or an adaptation. When those mice reproduce, the black fur will likely be one of the traits that gets passed on or selected. And eventually, after many generations, the species will consist of almost all black-furred mice. That species now has adapted to their new environment.